The morning Captain Derek Sullivan slammed federal judge Rebecca Washington against his patrol car would become the most catastrophic mistake of his life. In that split second of blind rage and prejudice, 20 years of unchecked power came crashing down. What he thought was just another black woman to intimidate turned out to be one of the most powerful federal judges in Georgia, and she was about to teach him that no badge makes you untouchable. Stay with me through this incredible story of justice served cold and comment your city below so I can see how far this story of accountability has traveled. The September morning started like any other at the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in downtown Atlanta. The sun cast long shadows across the marble steps, and the American flag snapped in the crisp autumn breeze. Inside her chambers on the 7th floor, Federal Judge Rebecca Washington reviewed case files for the day's hearings. Her reading glasses perched delicately on her nose as she made notes in the margins of a complex securities fraud case. At 52, Judge Washington carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had fought for every inch of respect she commanded. Her journey from the housing projects of East Atlanta to the federal bench hadn't been easy. Every accolade Harvard Law Review youngest black woman appointed to the federal judiciary in Georgia, a reputation for fairness that even her harshest critics couldn't deny, had been earned through brilliance, determination, and an unshakable belief in the law's power to deliver justice. She glanced at the antique clock on her bookshelf, a gift from her late mother, who had cleaned offices in this very building 30 years ago. It was 7:45 a.m. She had 15 minutes before her clerk would arrive with the morning's urgent motions. Rebecca closed the file, removed her glasses, and decided to retrieve some additional documents from her car that she'd reviewed at home the night before. The parking garage adjacent to the courthouse was nearly empty at this hour, save for a few early-arriving attorneys and court staff. Rebecca's modest black sedan sat in its reserved spot, marked simply, Reserved Federal Judiciary. She never used the more prominent spots closer to the entrance, preferring to leave those for visitors with mobility issues, despite her seniority entitling her to any spot she wanted. As she approached her vehicle, the screech of tires echoed through the concrete structure. A white police cruiser from the Atlanta Police Department came barreling around the corner, music blaring from its windows, a peculiar sight for what should have been an on-duty patrol car. The vehicle swung wide into the spot directly behind Rebecca's car, so close that its bumper nearly kissed hers. Captain Derek Sullivan emerged from the driver's seat like a storm cloud given human form. At 48, he was a mountain of a man, 6'3", 240 pounds of muscle, slowly going to fat, with a face weathered by 2 decades of policing Atlanta's streets. His uniform stretched tight across his chest, adorned with commendations and ribbons that told the story of a career built on aggressive policing and unwavering loyalty from his superiors. But those who worked under him knew a different story. They knew about the complaints that mysteriously disappeared, the body camera footage that somehow always malfunctioned during crucial moments, and the unwritten rule that you didn't cross Captain Sullivan unless you wanted your career to die a slow, painful death. "Hey!" Sullivan's voice boomed across the garage. "You can't park here." Rebecca turned slowly, her expression calm, despite the aggressive tone. She was dressed in a conservative navy suit, her judicial identification badge clipped to her jacket pocket. "I'm sorry, officer, but this is my assigned parking spot. I don't give a damn what you think your spot is." Sullivan interrupted, stepping closer. His breath carried the stale mixture of coffee and cigarettes. "This is a restricted area. You people always think you can park wherever you want." The words hung in the air like a poison. You people. Rebecca had heard those words countless times throughout her life, each time carrying the same venomous undertone. But she maintained her composure, understanding that this situation required de-escalation. "Captain," she said, reading his rank insignia. "I'm Judge Rebecca Washington. This is my assigned spot. If you check with courthouse security..." Sullivan laughed a harsh bark that echoed off the concrete walls. "Judge Wright, and I'm the commissioner. Look, lady, I don't have time for games. You've got 30 seconds to move this car before I have it towed." Rebecca reached for her identification, moving slowly and deliberately. "Captain Sullivan," she said, reading his nameplate. "Badge number 4782. I'm going to show you my federal identification. I'd advise you to—" The movement was sudden and violent. Sullivan's hand shot out, grabbing Rebecca's wrist before she could retrieve her ID. With a motion practiced over years of aggressive arrests, he spun her around and slammed her against the hood of his patrol car. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs and sent pain shooting through her ribs. "Reaching for something," Sullivan snarled. "That's threatening an officer. Hands behind your back. Now." Rebecca's mind raced, but her voice remained steady despite the pain. "Captain Sullivan, you're making a serious mistake. I'm a federal judge. This is assault on a federal official. Release me immediately." "Federal judge," Sullivan mocked, pressing harder. "You know what I think? I think you're another entitled diversity hire who thinks she owns the place. Well, let me educate you about how the real world works." Two younger officers had emerged from the passenger side of the cruiser. Officers Michael Chen and James Roberts, both in their late 20s, both looking increasingly uncomfortable as the situation escalated. Chen, a second-generation Korean-American who had joined the force with dreams of making a difference, shifted nervously. Roberts, fresh from the academy just 6 months ago, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. "Captain," Chen ventured carefully. "Maybe we should verify." "Did I ask for your opinion, Chen?" Sullivan snapped, without looking back. "Secure the scene." Rebecca's legal mind cataloged every detail, even as her cheek pressed against the cold metal of the patrol car's hood. "Officers Chen and Roberts," she said, clearly, ensuring her voice would be picked up by any recording devices. "I'm Federal Judge Rebecca Washington of the Northern District of Georgia. I'm ordering you to intervene in this unlawful detention. Captain Sullivan is committing assault on a federal official under Title 18, Section 111 of the United States Code." Roberts took an involuntary step back. Even fresh from the academy, he knew enough about federal law to understand the catastrophic implications of what she was saying. "Captain, she knows federal statutes. Maybe she really is. She's a lawyer." Sullivan cut him off. "They all know how to quote laws. Doesn't mean shit. Roberts, call for a transport wagon. We're taking her in for trespassing, resisting arrest, and threatening an officer." Rebecca's voice remained calm, but carried an edge of steel. "Captain Sullivan, you're currently being recorded by at least 12 courthouse security cameras. Federal marshals monitor this garage in real time. If you proceed with this arrest, you'll be in federal custody within the hour." For a moment, Sullivan hesitated. Then his ego, built on 20 years of unchallenged authority, overrode any whisper of caution. "Nice try. But this is city property adjacent to the federal building. My jurisdiction." He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. The parking garage, while appearing to be separate, was actually federal property leased from the city, a technicality that would soon destroy everything Sullivan had built. As Sullivan reached for his handcuffs, Rebecca's case files, which she had been carrying, scattered across the garage floor. The federal seal on each document was clearly visible, along with classifications marking them as sensitive judicial materials. Chen bent to look at one and went pale. "Captain." Chen's voice cracked. "These are real federal documents. Sealed indictments. Only a federal judge would have—" "Plant evidence, would she?" Sullivan finished the sentence with his own twisted interpretation. "Add that to the charges, possession of classified materials." The handcuffs clicked around Rebecca's wrists, the metal cold and unforgiving. But it wasn't fear that filled her mind. It was a crystalline clarity about what would happen next. Sullivan had no idea that he had just handcuffed one of the most connected judges in the federal system, a woman who had the personal cell phone numbers of the Attorney General, the FBI Director, and half the Senate Judiciary Committee. "Captain Sullivan," Rebecca said as he pulled her upright. "I want you to remember this moment. Remember that I gave you every opportunity to stop. Remember that Officers Chen and Roberts witnessed me identify myself multiple times. Because when this is over, and it will be over very soon, I want you to know that you brought everything that's about to happen entirely upon yourself." Sullivan laughed again, but there was something in Rebecca's tone, an absolute certainty, that made the sound ring hollow. "Is that a threat?" "No, Captain. It's a federal judge informing you of the consequences of your actions. You've just assaulted a Senate-confirmed member of the federal judiciary on federal property while attempting to interfere with sealed federal cases. The minimum sentence is 5 years. But given your abuse of authority and the civil rights violations inherent in your actions, you people, was particularly noted. You're looking at significantly more." Chen and Roberts exchanged worried glances. They could hear the truth in her voice, the kind of truth that comes from someone who isn't bluffing, isn't scared, and knows exactly how this story ends. Sullivan, however, was too far gone in his rage to listen. "Save your speeches for lockup. You're going to have a long time to practice them." As he marched Rebecca toward the transport wagon that had just arrived, neither of them noticed the black federal SUV that had pulled into the garage's upper level, nor the U.S. Marshal inside, who was already on his radio, his voice tight with urgency. "We have a situation in the courthouse garage. Judge Washington is being detained by local PD. I repeat, someone is arresting Judge Washington." The morning had started like any other. But in that parking garage, the collision of two worlds, one built on unchecked power and prejudice, the other on law and justice, had just set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not just two lives, but an entire system. Rebecca remained silent as Sullivan guided her roughly toward the transport wagon, but her mind was already 3 moves ahead. She thought of her mother who had cleaned these very buildings while dreaming of her daughter's success. She thought of every young black lawyer who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she thought of Captain Derek Sullivan, who had no idea that his 20-year reign of terror had just come to an end. The security cameras captured every moment Sullivan's rough handling the scattered federal documents, Chen and Roberts' obvious discomfort, and Rebecca's dignified composure, even in handcuffs. Each frame would soon become evidence in a case that would make national headlines. But more importantly, those cameras captured the exact moment when institutional racism collided with institutional power, and for once, for this one shining moment, justice would have the final word. As the transport wagon's doors began to close, Rebecca heard it, the distant wail of multiple sirens converging on the courthouse. Not the lazy approach of routine backup, but the urgent scream of federal agents responding to an emergency that threatened one of their own. Sullivan heard it too, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Captain," Roberts said nervously, "that sounds like a lot of units." Sullivan's jaw tightened. Standard backup for a resistant suspect. But they all knew he hadn't called for backup, which meant someone else had. The transport officer, a veteran named Willis, who had been on the force for 15 years, looked through his rearview mirror at Rebecca, sitting calmly in the back, her posture perfect, despite the handcuffs, her expression serene. He'd transported hundreds of suspects over the years, and he knew fear when he saw it. But this woman wasn't afraid. She was waiting. "Captain Sullivan," Willis called out hesitantly. "You sure about this? She doesn't seem like your typical perp." "Just drive, Willis," Sullivan barked, but his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. The sirens were getting closer, many sirens from different directions all converging on their location. Chen pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages, but actually pulling up the federal judiciary website. His face went white as Judge Rebecca Washington's official portrait filled his screen, the same woman now sitting handcuffed in their transport wagon. "Oh, fuck," Chen whispered, the phone slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Roberts caught a glimpse of the screen as the phone fell. The blood drained from his face as he recognized the woman they had just helped arrest. Captain, we need to..." The first federal SUV screeched into the garage, followed immediately by 3 more. They didn't approach cautiously like typical backup. They came in hot vehicles positioned to block every exit, agents emerging with the kind of coordinated precision that only comes from years of training. U.S. Marshal Teresa Santos stepped out of the lead vehicle, her hand resting on her service weapon, her expression carved from stone. Behind her, 6 more marshals fanned out their movements, professional but urgent. These weren't local cops responding to a call. These were federal agents protecting one of their highest-ranking officials. "Captain Sullivan." Santos's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "U.S. Marshals, step away from the vehicle and keep your hands visible." Sullivan's hand instinctively moved toward his own weapon, a reflex born from 20 years of being the one giving orders, not taking them. "This is my arrest. You have no jurisdiction." "That woman in your wagon," Santos interrupted, her voice deadly calm, "is Federal Judge Rebecca Washington of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. You're on federal property, and you've just committed assault on a federal official. So I'll say this once more: step away from the vehicle." The words hit Sullivan like physical blows. Each one chipped away at the wall of arrogance he'd built over 2 decades. Federal judge, federal property, federal crime. Willis had already turned off the wagon's engine and stepped out, his hands visible, wanting no part of what was about to happen. Chen and Roberts stood frozen, caught between their loyalty to their captain and their growing realization of the catastrophe they'd just participated in. "This is a misunderstanding," Sullivan tried, but his voice had lost all its earlier authority. She didn't identify herself properly. She identified herself 3 times. Santos cut him off. "We have it all on surveillance, audio and video. Now you're going to uncuff Judge Washington immediately, or I'm going to do it for you, and I promise you won't like my way." Sullivan's world was crumbling in real time. Every survival instinct told him to comply. But his ego, that massive, fragile thing that had defined his entire career, wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of his subordinates. Not in front of the black woman he'd just humiliated. "She was trespassing," he said weakly. "Resisting." In her own assigned parking spot, Santos stepped closer and Sullivan could see more federal vehicles arriving. FBI sedans, now their occupants emerging with the grim efficiency of agents who'd just been told a federal judge was in custody. "Captain Sullivan, you're making this worse with every word. Uncuff her, now." With shaking hands, Sullivan approached the wagon. Willis had already opened the rear doors, and there sat Judge Washington, as composed as if she were holding court rather than sitting in custody. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Sullivan saw his future, or rather the absence of it. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as he unlocked the handcuffs. "I don't," Rebecca said, simply rubbing her wrists as the metal fell away. "Anything you say now will only be used against you later. As someone who's presided over hundreds of criminal cases, I'm actually doing you a favor by telling you to stop talking." She stepped out of the wagon with the same dignity she brought to her courtroom, straightening her suit jacket and retrieving her judicial identification from her pocket. She held it up for Sullivan to see clearly, the seal of the federal judiciary, her photograph, her title in bold letters, United States District Judge. "I told you who I was," she said quietly, "multiple times. But you were so blinded by what you thought you saw, a black woman who didn't belong, that you couldn't hear me. That blindness is going to cost you everything." FBI Special Agent David Kim approached, his expression grim. "Judge Washington, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, Agent Kim. Thank you for responding so quickly." Kim nodded, then turned to Sullivan. "Captain Derek Sullivan, I'm placing you under arrest for violation of Title 18, Section 111, assault on a federal official. You have the right to remain silent." As Kim read Sullivan his rights, the captain's eyes darted around the garage, looking for support, for a way out, for someone to tell him this was all a mistake. But Chen and Roberts had backed away, understanding that proximity to Sullivan was now career suicide. Willis had disappeared entirely, and the federal agents surrounding him made it clear that his 20 years of authority meant nothing here. "This is ridiculous," Sullivan exploded as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, the same cuffs that had just held Judge Washington. "I'm a decorated captain, 20 years on the force. You can't..." "We can, and we are," Santos said flatly. "And Captain, that's just the federal charges. Wait until the civil rights violations are added. You people, wasn't it? That's going to play really well in court." As they led Sullivan to a federal vehicle, Rebecca stood watching, surrounded by federal agents who were equal parts protective and apologetic. Her phone was already ringing. Word traveled fast in the federal building, and her colleagues were learning what had happened to one of their own. But Rebecca didn't answer yet. Instead, she watched as Captain Derek Sullivan was placed in the back of a federal SUV, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror as the reality of his situation began to sink in. 20 years of power, 20 years of authority, 20 years of never being held accountable. All of it ending in a courthouse parking garage because he couldn't see past his own prejudice. Chen and Roberts stood awkwardly nearby, unsure of what to do. Rebecca approached them, and both men tensed. "Officers," she said calmly, "you're going to be interviewed by the FBI about this morning's events. I want you to know that I heard both of you try to intervene. That will be noted in my statement. But I also want you to understand something. Your captain's behavior didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because the system allowed it to happen, because people looked the other way, because complaints were buried and cameras malfunctioned." Chen found his voice. "Your Honor, we didn't know. If we had known who you were—" "That's exactly the problem," Rebecca interrupted gently. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm a federal judge or a janitor, what happened this morning was wrong. The badge doesn't give anyone the right to abuse citizens based on the color of their skin. You both know that, which is why you tried to stop him. The question now is, what are you going to do about it?" Roberts swallowed hard. "Your Honor, there are things we've seen, things that weren't right." Rebecca nodded. "Then you'll have an opportunity to make them right when the FBI interviews you. This is your chance to decide what kind of officers you want to be, the kind who perpetuate injustice, or the kind who stand against it." As she walked back toward the courthouse flanked by federal marshals, Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from her clerk. "Judge, the Chief Judge is looking for you. The news has already reached Washington. The Attorney General's office is on line 1. Rebecca allowed herself a small grim smile. Captain Sullivan thought this morning was about a parking spot, about putting someone he saw as beneath him in their place. But it was about so much more. It was about every person who'd ever been slammed against a car for the crime of existing while black. It was about every complaint that had been buried, every camera that had mysteriously malfunctioned, every officer who had looked the other way. The parking garage was filling with people. Now FBI agents processing the scene, courthouse employees who'd heard the commotion, and journalists who'd already gotten wind that something major had happened at the federal courthouse. Rebecca could see the cameras starting to arrive, the story beginning to spread. She thought again of her mother who'd cleaned these buildings while dreaming of justice. "Mama," she whispered, "you told me the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. Sometimes, though, we have to grab that arc and bend it ourselves." Inside the federal SUV, Captain Derek Sullivan sat in silence, his mind struggling to process how quickly his world had imploded. 20 minutes ago, he'd been a captain in the Atlanta Police Department, untouchable and unaccountable. Now he was a federal prisoner, his career over his freedom in jeopardy, his name about to become synonymous with the very corruption and racism that law enforcement claimed to stand against. The last thing he'd said to Judge Washington echoed in his mind. "You people always think you can park wherever you want." The irony was bitter and complete. For 20 years, he'd been the one parking wherever he wanted, doing whatever he wanted, accountable to no one. But this morning, he'd finally met someone who wouldn't move out of his way, someone who couldn't be intimidated or silenced, someone who had the power to ensure that justice long delayed would finally be served. As the SUV pulled away from the courthouse, Sullivan caught a glimpse of Judge Washington through the window. She stood tall despite what she'd just endured, speaking calmly to federal agents already working to ensure that what happened to her would lead to systemic change rather than just individual punishment. In that moment, Sullivan understood with crystal clarity that he hadn't just assaulted a judge, he'd challenged the very system of justice itself. And justice, as it turned out, had no patience left for men like him. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. In a few hours, the story would be national news. Captain Derek Sullivan's name would be known across the country, but not for his 20 years of service or his commendations. He would be known as the racist cop who assaulted a federal judge, the symbol of everything wrong with policing in America, the cautionary tale that would be taught in police academies for generations. But that was all still to come. For now, there was just the quiet hum of the federal SUV's engine as it carried Sullivan toward a future he'd never imagined, toward a reckoning 20 years in the making, toward the consequences of believing that a badge made him untouchable. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The federal building's secure holding area felt different from the city lockups Sullivan had walked through 1,000 times before. The walls were the same institutional beige, the fluorescent lights just as harsh, but here he wasn't the one with the keys. Here, he was just another suspect waiting to be processed, and the weight of that reality pressed down on him like a physical force. Special Agent David Kim sat across from Sullivan in the interview room, a manila folder thick with documents spread between them. The agent's expression was professionally neutral, but Sullivan could read the disgust beneath the surface. 20 years of reading suspects had taught him to recognize contempt, though he'd never expected to see it directed at him. "Captain Sullivan." Kim began, his voice measured and calm. "Before we discuss this morning's incident, I need to inform you that we've been investigating you for the past 18 months. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sullivan's mouth went dry. "Investigating for what?" Kim opened the folder, revealing photograph after photograph, document after document. "Excessive force complaints, 47 of them over your career. Remarkably, all dismissed or ruled unfounded by internal affairs. Strange how that works, isn't it?" Sullivan's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Harrison Blake, whom the police union had sent, placed a warning hand on his client's arm. "My client doesn't have to answer." "He doesn't," Kim agreed. "But he might want to listen. Because what happened this morning with Judge Washington, that wasn't an isolated incident. It was the final piece of a pattern we've been documenting for a year and a half." Kim pulled out a photograph, a young black man with a swollen eye and split lip. "Marcus Johnson, age 23, pulled over for a broken taillight last year. Ended up in the hospital with 3 broken ribs. Your report says he resisted arrest. His passenger's cell phone video, which we recently recovered, tells a different story." Another photograph. A Latino teenager, arm in a cast. "Diego Martinez, 17. You said he reached for a weapon during a stop and frisk. Witnesses say he was reaching for his inhaler during an asthma attack." Sullivan's face had gone pale. Blake leaned forward. "These are old allegations, without corroboration." "Oh, we have corroboration," Kim interrupted, pulling out a tablet. "Officer Michelle Foster. Remember her, Captain Young officer, who filed a complaint against you 5 years ago for racial harassment and creating a hostile work environment? The complaint that mysteriously disappeared from her personnel file." On the screen was a video deposition. Officer Foster, now Detective Foster, with the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office, sitting in what looked like a federal building conference room. Captain Sullivan ran his shift like his personal kingdom. Foster's recorded voice filled the room. "If you were white and played ball, you were golden. If you were black or brown, or if you stood up to him, your life became hell. I watched him plant evidence twice. I reported it. Nothing happened except my career at APD ended." Sullivan wanted to protest, to deny, to rage against the accusation, but Blake's grip on his arm tightened. The attorney knew, as Sullivan was beginning to understand, that every word he spoke would only dig the hole deeper. Kim continued relentlessly. "We have 17 officers willing to testify about your conduct. We have video evidence from body cameras you thought were off. We have financial records showing some interesting deposits that coincide with certain drug busts where evidence mysteriously went missing. But you know what we didn't have until this morning? He paused, letting the silence build. We didn't have you on federal charges. We didn't have you dead to rights on camera, assaulting someone whose credibility is unimpeachable. Judge Washington isn't some kid from the projects whose word can be dismissed. She's a federal judge with a spotless reputation, and you assaulted her on federal property in front of witnesses all caught on crystal-clear surveillance video. Kim pulled out another document. The U.S. Attorney has already convened a grand jury. Not just for this morning's assault, but for civil rights violations going back years. Every person of color you've wronged, every false report you've filed, every complaint that was buried, it's all coming out. Meanwhile, 3 floors up in the federal courthouse, Judge Rebecca Washington sat in Chief Judge Harold Morrison's chamber's ice pack pressed against her ribs, where Sullivan had slammed her into the patrol car. Morrison, a 70-year-old white man who'd been on the bench for 30 years, looked angrier than Rebecca had ever seen him. "In my 3 decades as a judge," Morrison said, his voice shaking with rage, "I have never seen such a blatant assault on the judiciary. That thug—" "Harold," Rebecca said quietly. "Please, he's not a thug. He's a racist with a badge who's been enabled by a broken system. Calling him names diminishes the systemic nature of what we're dealing with." Morrison paused, then nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. Even now, even after what he did to you, you're thinking about the bigger picture. That's why you're the best judge in this district, Rebecca." "I'm thinking about all the people who didn't have my protections," Rebecca replied, shifting the ice pack. "How many people did Sullivan hurt who didn't have federal marshals to call? How many complaints were buried because the victims didn't have my credibility or connections?" A knock on the door interrupted them. Morrison's clerk entered, looking shaken. "Judge Morrison." "Judge Washington. You need to see this. The news has broken." She turned on the large television mounted on the wall. Every major news channel was covering the story. CNN's breaking news banner read, "Federal judge assaulted by police captain in Atlanta." Fox News had, "Racial incident at federal courthouse sparks outrage." MSNBC was already running a panel discussion titled, "The Assault on Justice When Police Attack Judges." But it was the local Atlanta station that had the most damaging coverage for Sullivan. They'd somehow already obtained Officer Chen's body camera footage. He'd forgotten to turn it off in the chaos, and it was playing on repeat. Sullivan's voice clear as day. "You people always think you can park wherever you want." The slam against the car. Judge Washington calmly identifying herself. Sullivan's mocking response. "My God," Morrison breathed. "It's everywhere." Rebecca's phone had been ringing non-stop. She looked at the caller ID. The Attorney General again, 3 senators from the Judiciary Committee, the president of the National Bar Association, and dozens of fellow judges from across the country. The legal community was rallying around one of their own, but more importantly, they were seeing this as an attack on the independence of the judiciary itself. Judge Washington. Her clerk Thomas appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor cracked with emotion. "There are 300 people gathering on the courthouse steps. Judges, attorneys, civil rights leaders. They're demanding justice." Rebecca stood wincing slightly at the pain in her ribs. "Then let's not keep them waiting. Harold, I need to address this publicly." "Rebecca, you should rest." "No," she said firmly. "If I don't speak now, the narrative becomes about me as a victim. This is bigger than me. This is about every person who's been brutalized by police who think they're above the law. I need to make that clear." Down in the holding area, Sullivan could hear the crowd gathering outside. The chants were growing louder. "Justice for Judge Washington. End police brutality. No one is above the law. They're going to crucify me." Sullivan said, his voice hollow. Blake closed his briefcase with a snap. "Captain, I'm going to be honest with you. The federal charges alone carry a minimum of 5 years. With the civil rights violations they're adding, you're looking at 20 to life. And that's if the state doesn't file their own charges for the previous incidents." 20 to life. Sullivan's voice cracked. "For one mistake?" "One mistake. Kim stood his composure finally cracking. "You've been making mistakes for 20 years. The only difference is, this time you made it against someone who could fight back." As Kim left the room, Sullivan was left alone with his attorney and the crushing weight of his new reality. Outside, he could hear footsteps, many footsteps approaching the holding area. The door opened and U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen entered, no relation to Officer Chen, though the coincidence would be noted by reporters later. She was known for her aggressive prosecution of civil rights cases, and the look in her eyes told Sullivan everything he needed to know about his chances. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, not granting him the courtesy of his former rank, "I want you to understand something. You didn't just assault Judge Washington. You assaulted the rule of law itself. You demonstrated that you believe your badge puts you above the very system you swore to uphold. I take that personally." She laid out a series of photographs on the table, every victim from the past 20 years whose cases they'd uncovered. Black faces, brown faces, young faces, old faces. All with one thing in common: they'd encountered Captain Derek Sullivan on what he'd considered a bad day. "Each of these people will get their day in court," Chen continued. "Each of them will testify about what you did to them. And Judge Washington's case will be the cornerstone that validates all of their stories. You gave us the gift of proving your pattern of behavior against someone whose word cannot be questioned." Sullivan stared at the photographs, and for the first time in 20 years, he truly saw the pain he'd caused, not because he suddenly developed empathy, but because each face now represented years added to his sentence. Back in Chief Judge Morrison's chambers, Rebecca was preparing for her press conference when another knock came. This time, it was Officers Chen and Roberts, escorted by federal agents. Both young men looked terrified. "Your Honor," Officer Chen began, his voice shaking, "we came to apologize. And to give you this." He held out a flash drive with trembling hands. "What is this?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Every incident we witnessed or heard about involving Captain Sullivan," Roberts said quietly. "Body cam footage he didn't know existed, audio recordings of him bragging about arrests, documentation of complaints that were made to disappear. We should have come forward sooner." Rebecca took the drive, her expression thoughtful. "Why didn't you?" Chen's composure finally broke. "Because we were scared, Your Honor. Sullivan had connections everywhere. Officers who crossed him ended up dead on traffic stops that went wrong, or transferred to the worst assignments until they quit. But after this morning, after seeing him attack a federal judge, we realized if he could do that to you, what chance did regular citizens have? We want to testify," Roberts added. "We want to help make this right." Rebecca studied both young men for a long moment. "You understand that by coming forward, you're likely ending your careers with the Atlanta Police Department?" Both officers nodded. Chen spoke for them both. "Maybe, but we joined the force to protect and serve, not to be complicit in brutalizing citizens. If APD won't let us be good cops, then maybe we need to find somewhere that will." "Thomas," Rebecca said to her clerk, "please escort these officers to the U.S. Attorney's office. Ms. Chen will want to debrief them immediately." As the officers left, Morrison shook his head in amazement. "In 30 years on the bench, I've never seen police officers voluntarily turn over evidence against their captain." "That's because for 30 years captains like Sullivan have been protected," Rebecca replied. "But something changed this morning. The thin blue line cracked and these young officers decided they'd rather be on the right side of history than the wrong side of a badge." The press had assembled on the courthouse steps, not just local media, but national outlets, their satellite trucks lining the street. The crowd had grown to over 500 people, including dozens of judges who had left their courtrooms to stand in solidarity. When Rebecca emerged from the courthouse flanked by federal marshals, a hush fell over the crowd. She walked slowly to the microphones, each step measured, despite the pain in her ribs. Behind her stood Chief Judge Morrison, U.S. Attorney Chen, and a phalanx of federal law enforcement officials. "This morning," Rebecca began, her voice carrying across the plaza without wavering. "I was assaulted by Captain Derek Sullivan of the Atlanta Police Department. But this isn't about me. This is about what Captain Sullivan represents: a culture of impunity that allows officers to abuse their power without consequence." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "For 20 years, Captain Sullivan terrorized communities of color in this city. Complaints were filed and buried. Videos mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. The system that was supposed to protect citizens instead protected him." The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. But this morning, Captain Sullivan made a crucial error. He assumed that his badge made him untouchable. He assumed that the color of my skin made me a target. He assumed that 20 years of getting away with abuse meant he always would. He was wrong on all counts. Applause rippled through the crowd, but Rebecca raised her hand for silence. "I want to be clear about something. I am not celebrating. A man's life is being destroyed today, a man who destroyed many lives over 2 decades. There's no joy in that. There's only the grim satisfaction of knowing that justice long delayed is finally being served." She looked directly into the main news camera, knowing Sullivan would be watching from his cell. "To the officers who enabled Captain Sullivan's behavior through silence or active participation, we're coming for you too. The investigation doesn't end with him. To the officers who want to come forward, who want to be on the right side of history, now is your chance. The Department of Justice has set up a hotline. Use it. And to the citizens who have suffered under Captain Sullivan and others like him, your voices matter. Your pain matters. Your stories will finally be heard. We failed you for 20 years, but that failure ends today." Back in the holding cell, Sullivan watched the press conference on a small television, his face ashen. Every word from Judge Washington was another nail in his coffin. But it was what came next that truly broke him. The screen split to show another press conference across town. Atlanta Police Chief Patricia Williams, the first black woman to hold the position, stood at her own podium. Sullivan had always dismissed her as a diversity hire, someone promoted for politics rather than merit. Now she held his fate in her hands. "Effective immediately," Chief Williams announced. "Captain Derek Sullivan's employment with the Atlanta Police Department is terminated. His peace officer certification is being revoked, and we are cooperating fully with federal authorities in their investigation not just of Sullivan, but of systemic failures within our department that allowed his behavior to continue unchecked." She paused, her expression hard as granite. "I am also announcing a comprehensive review of all complaints dismissed by Internal Affairs over the past 20 years. Any officer who participated in covering up misconduct will face consequences. Any supervisor who looked the other way will be held accountable. The days of the blue wall of silence protecting criminals with badges are over." Sullivan turned away from the television, unable to watch more. His attorney sat beside him, silent. There was nothing left to say. 20 years of power. 20 years of authority. 20 years of terrorizing those he saw as beneath him. All of it had crumbled in a single morning. But the day wasn't over yet. At 3 p.m., a federal grand jury was convened in an emergency session. One by one, witnesses testified. Officer Foster appeared in person, having driven from DeKalb County to add her voice to the chorus. Officers Chen and Roberts presented their evidence, their hands shaking, but their voices steady. 3 civilians who'd been brutalized by Sullivan over the years, emboldened by the morning's events, came forward to testify. And then, at 4:47 p.m., Judge Rebecca Washington herself took the stand. Not as a judge, but as a victim. She spoke for 45 minutes, detailing not just the morning's assault, but contextualizing it within a pattern of abuse that had plagued Atlanta for 2 decades. "Captain Sullivan didn't see me as a judge this morning," she testified. "He didn't see me as a human being deserving of respect. He saw me as a black woman who needed to be put in her place. The tragedy isn't that it happened to me. I have resources and recourse. The tragedy is that it's happened to thousands of others who didn't." By 5:30 p.m., The grand jury had returned a 37-count indictment: assault on a federal official, deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, false imprisonment. The list went on and on, each charge carrying years in federal prison. As Sullivan was transferred from the holding cell to the federal detention center to await arraignment, he passed by a television showing the evening news. His photograph, the official department photo where he looked stern and authoritative, was displayed next to Judge Washington's official portrait. The chyron read, "The Captain and the Judge, a story of power and justice." But there was another image that would become the defining visual of the case. Someone had captured a photograph that morning at the exact moment Sullivan was slamming Judge Washington against the car. Her face was composed, despite the violence, dignified, despite the assault. His face was contorted with rage, the very picture of abuse of power. The image was already going viral, already becoming a symbol of everything wrong with policing in America. That night, as Sullivan sat in his federal cell, a very different experience from the city lockups he knew so well, he could hear other inmates discussing his case. These were federal prisoners, many of them there for white-collar crimes, but they all knew what happened to cops in prison. And they all knew that a cop who'd assaulted a federal judge would have an even bigger target on his back. His cellmate, a man doing 5 years for tax evasion, looked at him with a mixture of disgust and pity. 20 years as a cop, and you threw it all away because you couldn't control your racism for 5 minutes. Sullivan didn't answer. What could he say? That he'd done the same thing hundreds of times before without consequence. That the only difference this time was that his victim had power. That he was sorry not for what he'd done, but for getting caught. Miles away, Judge Rebecca Washington sat in her home study ice pack still pressed to her ribs, surrounded by case files for the next day's docket. She'd refused to take time off, refused to let Sullivan's assault derail her work. But she wasn't reviewing cases just yet. Instead, she was drafting a letter to Congress co-signed by 70 federal judges from across the country calling for comprehensive police reform legislation. The letter would eventually become the foundation for the Federal Police Accountability Act landmark legislation that would require all police departments receiving federal funding to maintain independent oversight boards, mandate body cameras that couldn't be turned off during citizen encounters, and create a national database of officers dismissed for misconduct. But that was still to come. For now, Rebecca simply wrote the pain in her ribs, a constant reminder of the morning's violence, but also a reminder of why this work was necessary. Her phone rang, her personal cell, not the official one. She smiled when she saw the caller ID. "Hi, Mama," she said, her voice softening. "Baby girl?" Her mother's voice came through thick with emotion. "I saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mama. Bruised, but fine." There was a pause, then her mother spoke again, her voice stronger. "You know what I thought when I saw that video? I thought about all those nights I came home from cleaning those courthouse bathrooms, my knees aching, my hands raw from chemicals. I thought about how I used to picture you in one of those fancy offices making a difference. And today, baby girl, you didn't just make a difference. You changed everything." Rebecca's eyes welled with tears, the first she'd allowed herself all day. "I learned from you, Mama. You taught me that dignity isn't about what job you have or what people call you. It's about standing up straight even when the world tries to bend you. That man, that captain," her mother continued, "he thought your power came from your title. But I saw that video, baby. Your power came from knowing who you are, from knowing your worth. That's something no badge or gun can take away." After the call ended, Rebecca returned to her work, but her mind kept drifting to the larger implications of the day's events. How many Captain Sullivans were out there protected by their departments, enabled by their colleagues, free to terrorize communities with impunity? How many victims never got justice because they didn't have federal marshals to call, didn't have irrefutable video evidence, didn't have unimpeachable credibility? The system had worked for her because she was part of the system. But what about everyone else? As midnight approached, the city of Atlanta was still buzzing with the day's events. In police precincts across the city, officers were being called in for emergency meetings. Internal Affairs, under federal supervision, now was reopening hundreds of closed cases. Officers who had been silent for years were finally finding their voices, calling the DOJ hotline to report misconduct they'd witnessed. In the federal detention center, Derek Sullivan lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. 20 years of nights he'd gone home to his comfortable suburban house. 20 years of commendations and celebrations, 20 years of believing he was untouchable. All of it ended because he couldn't see past his own prejudice, couldn't recognize that the woman he was brutalizing had more power than his badge could ever give him. But perhaps the most tragic part of Derek Sullivan's story was that he still didn't understand. As he lay there in his cell, he wasn't thinking about the lives he'd destroyed or the pain he'd caused. He wasn't experiencing remorse or revelation. He was only thinking about how unfair it was that after 20 years of getting away with it, he'd finally picked the wrong victim. The morning of Sullivan's arraignment arrived with the kind of media circus usually reserved for celebrity trials or political scandals. News vans lined the street outside the federal courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray September sky like metallic flowers seeking sun. Protesters had been gathering since dawn, their signs reading, "Justice for all victims," and "End the blue wall of silence." Inside the courthouse, in a holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Derek Sullivan sat in his orange jumpsuit, a far cry from the crisp uniform he'd worn with such pride for 2 decades. His attorney, Harrison Blake, was reviewing documents with the focused intensity of a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle. "Derek," Blake said quietly, using his first name, now that the captain's rank meant nothing. "The prosecution is offering a deal. Plead guilty to the federal charges, cooperate fully with the investigation into the department, and they'll recommend 15 years instead of pursuing the maximum." Sullivan's laugh was bitter and short. 15 years, I'll be 63 when I get out. If I get out? It's better than life, Blake pointed out. And given what they have on you, life is a real possibility. Through the reinforced window of the holding room, Sullivan could see into the hallway where federal marshals were escorting other defendants. One of them, a young black man in his 20s, locked eyes with Sullivan. The recognition was immediate. Sullivan had arrested him 3 years ago on drug charges that were later dismissed due to what the official report called procedural errors. What it really meant was that Sullivan had planted the evidence, but couldn't make it stick. The young man's expression wasn't angry or vengeful. It was worse than that. It was satisfied, as if cosmic justice had finally balanced the scales. He nodded slowly at Sullivan before being led away. And in that nod was everything Sullivan had refused to acknowledge for 20 years, that the people he'd brutalized were human beings with memory and dignity, and that eventually, somehow, the universe would hold him accountable. Judge Rebecca Washington was not presiding over the arraignment, of course. That would have been a clear conflict of interest. Instead, Senior District Judge Martin Kellerman, a 75-year-old veteran known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal justice, would handle the proceedings. But Rebecca was there, seated in the gallery's front row, her presence a silent reminder of why they were all gathered. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was taken with more people standing along the walls. The gallery was a cross-section of Atlanta civil rights leaders, police officers, some in uniform, others deliberately in civilian clothes, community activists, and dozens of Sullivan's victims who had come to witness this moment. Among them sat Marcus Johnson, the young man whose ribs Sullivan had broken during a traffic stop. His mother held his hand, tears streaming down her face. Diego Martinez was there too, his arm healed, but his faith in law enforcement forever shattered. Officer Michelle Foster, whose career Sullivan had destroyed for speaking out, sat ramrod straight in her DeKalb County Sheriff's uniform, her presence a testament to survival and perseverance. When Sullivan was brought in, a collective intake of breath rippled through the room. The man who had strutted through Atlanta's streets like he owned them now shuffled in leg irons, his wrists cuffed to a chain around his waist. The transformation was complete, from predator to prisoner, in less than 48 hours. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and Judge Kellerman entered his black robes, seeming to absorb all light in the room. He took his seat and surveyed the packed courtroom with sharp eyes that had seen every form of human failure and redemption. "Be seated," Kellerman said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "We're here for the arraignment of Derek Sullivan on 37 federal counts. Mr. Sullivan, do you understand the charges against you?" Sullivan stood Blake beside him. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible. "Speak up, Mr. Sullivan," Kellerman said firmly. "These proceedings require clarity." "Yes, Your Honor." Sullivan repeated louder this time, but hollow, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen stood to present the government's case, her posture reflecting the gravity of the moment. "Your Honor. The defendant is charged with multiple counts of deprivation of rights, under color of law assault on a federal official conspiracy to obstruct justice and numerous related charges, stemming from a pattern of abuse spanning 2 decades. She paused, letting the weight of the accusations settle over the courtroom. "The government has video evidence, multiple witness testimonies, and documentation showing that Mr. Sullivan systematically violated the civil rights of citizens, particularly citizens of color, while using his position in the Atlanta Police Department to avoid accountability. The assault on Judge Washington was not an aberration, but the culmination of years of unchecked abuse of power." Blake stood to respond, his voice professional but strained. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. We request reasonable bail." The laugh that erupted from the gallery was quickly silenced by Kellerman's gavel, but the damage was done. The very idea of Sullivan being released on bail seemed absurd to those who had been denied that same courtesy during his arrests of them. "Mr. Blake." Kellerman said, his tone suggesting he too found the request problematic. "Your client assaulted a federal judge on federal property. He has extensive connections in law enforcement that could facilitate flight or witness intimidation. On what grounds do you believe bail is appropriate?" Blake struggled to find solid footing. "My client has ties to the community. Your Honor, he owns a home, has family here. So did every person he falsely arrested and held without cause." Chen interrupted. "Your Honor, the government requests remand. The defendant poses a clear danger to the community and a flight risk given his law enforcement connections." Kellerman didn't hesitate. "I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Sullivan, you are remanded to federal custody pending trial. Given the nature of the charges and the evidence presented, bail is denied." The gavel came down with finality, and Sullivan seemed to shrink into himself. As the marshals prepared to lead him away, he turned to scan the gallery. His eyes found his wife Patricia, who had come despite everything. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was just empty, as if the man she'd married 23 years ago had been replaced by a stranger she didn't recognize. Their son, Derek Jr., a freshman at Georgia State, sat beside her. The young man who had once proudly told everyone his father was a police captain now slouched in his seat trying to disappear. The shame radiated from him in waves, the kind of shame that changes a family's trajectory forever. As Sullivan was led past the gallery, Marcus Johnson's mother stood up. "You broke my baby's ribs," she said, her voice steady but filled with years of suppressed rage. "You left him bleeding on the sidewalk. You laughed while you did it." The marshals paused, allowing the moment to happen. Kellerman didn't intervene. "Ms. Johnson," Sullivan started, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare speak to me," she said. "For 3 years I've waited to see you without that badge, without that gun, without that power you used to hurt my child. Look at you now. Orange suits you better than blue ever did." The marshals resumed walking, but others stood as Sullivan passed. They didn't shout or threaten. They simply bore witness, their presence a living indictment of 2 decades of abuse. Sullivan kept his eyes forward, but everyone could see his shoulders shaking. Outside the courtroom, Rebecca Washington stood at the same microphones where she'd addressed the crowd 2 days earlier. The questions came fast and fierce from the assembled media. "Judge Washington, how do you feel about Sullivan pleading not guilty?" Rebecca's response was measured and judicial. "Every defendant has the right to plead as they choose. The evidence will speak for itself at trial." Do you believe this is an isolated incident or indicative of systemic problems? When one officer can abuse citizens for 20 years despite dozens of complaints, that's not isolated. That's systemic. The Department of Justice's investigation will determine how deep this rot goes. What's your response to those calling you a hero for standing up to police abuse? Rebecca paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not a hero. I'm a federal judge who was assaulted and had the resources to fight back. The heroes are the victims who came forward knowing they might not be believed, who testified despite fear of retaliation, who kept fighting for justice even when the system failed them repeatedly." While Rebecca faced the media, a different drama was unfolding at Atlanta Police Headquarters. Chief Patricia Williams had called an emergency meeting of all supervisory staff. The conference room was packed with lieutenants, captains, and deputy chiefs, many of whom had worked alongside Sullivan for years. "I'm going to make this simple," Chief Williams began, her voice cutting through the nervous silence. "If any of you knew about Sullivan's behavior and did nothing, if you helped cover up complaints, if you participated in any way in the culture that allowed him to operate with impunity, now is your chance to come forward. The FBI is offering limited immunity to officers who cooperate fully with their investigation. That offer expires at midnight tonight." The room erupted in murmurs, fear palpable in the air. Deputy Chief Robert Hammond, a 30-year veteran who had been Sullivan's mentor, stood up. "Chief, with all due respect, Derek Sullivan was a good cop who made one mistake." "Stop," Williams commanded. "Stop right there. Sullivan didn't make one mistake. He made thousands of choices over 20 years to abuse his power, and every one of you who looked the other way enabled him." Deputy Chief Hammond, "I'm particularly interested in your role given that you personally dismissed 7 complaints against Sullivan over the past decade." Hammond's face went pale. "Those complaints were investigated and found to be without merit." "By investigators who reported directly to you," Williams interrupted. "Investigators who are now telling the FBI a very different story about pressure from above to make problems disappear." She let that sink in before continuing. "Gentlemen and I use that term loosely. The blue wall of silence that protected Sullivan is crumbling. Officers Chen and Roberts have already provided hundreds of hours of recorded evidence. Officer Foster's testimony has been corroborated by 17 other officers. The only question is whether you'll be on the right side of history or whether you'll go down with the ship Sullivan is dragging to the bottom." Lieutenant James Crawford, one of the younger supervisors, stood up. "Chief, I have information about Sullivan and others. I've been documenting things for the past 3 years, hoping someday someone would listen." "My office, Lieutenant. Now," Williams said. "Anyone else who wants to come forward, my door is open. For the rest of you, clean out your desks and pray the FBI doesn't come for you, because if they do, I won't lift a finger to help you." As the meeting dispersed, the sound of phones being pulled out filled the hallway. Lawyers were being called, union representatives contacted, and more than a few officers were already dialing the FBI's hotline. Back in his federal cell, Sullivan sat on his bunk, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the fog of shock and denial. His cellmate, the tax evader named Richard, was reading a newspaper with Sullivan's picture on the front page. "Says here you had 47 excessive force complaints," Richard said conversationally. "That's impressive. How'd you manage to keep your job?" Sullivan didn't answer, but Richard continued anyway. "I mean, I stole $8 million over 10 years before they caught me. But you stole people's dignity, their safety, their faith in justice. That's a special kind of evil." "I was doing my job," Sullivan muttered, the defense sounding weak even to his own ears. Richard lowered the newspaper, studying Sullivan with the kind of contempt usually reserved for child molesters in the prison hierarchy. "Your job. Your job was to protect and serve. Says here, you broke a young man's ribs during a traffic stop. That was your job." Sullivan turned to face the wall, but there was no escape from Richard's words or the truth they carried. "You know what the funny thing is?" Richard continued. "I'm a criminal. I admit it. I stole money, and I'm paying for it. But you wore a badge while you committed your crimes. You took an oath to uphold the law while you broke it every day. That makes you worse than me. At least I was honest about being a crook." That night, as Sullivan lay sleepless in his cell, the full weight of his transformation from powerful to powerless, from predator to prey, from Captain Sullivan to inmate number 47892, pressed down on him like a physical force. Outside, he could hear other inmates discussing his case, planning what they would do to a cop in general population. The protection of solitary confinement would only last so long. Meanwhile, across the city, Officers Chen and Roberts sat in a federal safe house, having been placed in protective custody after death threats from Sullivan's remaining supporters in the department. They were reviewing body camera footage with FBI agents identifying other officers who had participated in or witnessed Sullivan's crimes. "This one," Chen said, pointing at the screen showing Sullivan planting evidence during a drug bust 2 years ago. Officer Tommy Morrison was there. He saw Sullivan drop the bag, but he testified that the suspect had it. Roberts added, "Morrison's got a family, 2 kids. Sullivan threatened to have him transferred to the night shift in the worst precinct if he didn't back up the story." The FBI agent taking notes looked up. "Would Morrison testify to that now?" Chen and Roberts exchanged glances. "Maybe," Chen said. "If he knew he wasn't alone. If he knew others were coming forward too." The agent made a note. "We'll approach him tomorrow. Who else?" They continued through the night, frame by frame, incident by incident, building a case that would eventually implicate 14 other officers in Sullivan's network of corruption and abuse. At her home, Rebecca Washington sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, reviewing the congressional testimony she would give next week about police reform. Her mother sat across from her, having insisted on staying since the assault. "You know they're going to come after you," her mother said quietly. "Sullivan's supporters, the police union, all of them. They're going to try to destroy you." Rebecca looked up from her notes. "They can try, Mama. But I've got something they don't understand: legitimacy. I've got the law on my side, the facts on my side, and most importantly, I've got the truth on my side." "Truth doesn't always win, baby girl." "No," Rebecca agreed. "But this time it will. Because this time, the whole world is watching. Sullivan made the mistake of attacking someone who couldn't be silenced or discredited. And in doing so, he gave voice to everyone he'd silenced over the years." Her phone buzzed with a text from U.S. Attorney Chen. "Grand jury returned additional indictments. 14 more officers charged. Sullivan's deputy chief arrested an hour ago. The dam is broken." Rebecca showed the message to her mother, who smiled grimly. 20 years of evil coming undone in 3 days. That's biblical almost. "It's justice, Mama. Long overdue, but finally here." As the night deepened, Atlanta's power structure continued to shift. In police precincts across the city, officers were making choices that would define the rest of their careers. Some were destroying evidence that implicated them, not knowing that the FBI already had copies. Others were calling lawyers, trying to negotiate deals. Still others were coming forward, choosing integrity over loyalty to a corrupt system. At the Federal Detention Center, Derek Sullivan received his first taste of prison food, a far cry from the restaurants where he'd eaten for free, owners too afraid to charge the captain, who could make their lives hell with a single phone call. He picked at the overcooked vegetables and mystery meat, his appetite gone. A corrections officer appeared at his cell. "Sullivan, you've got a visitor." Sullivan looked up, hope flickering for a moment. Perhaps Patricia had come to tell him she still loved him, or Derek Jr., to say he understood. But when he reached the visiting room, separated from visitors by thick glass and speaking through phones that recorded every word, he found neither family member. Instead, Marcus Johnson sat on the other side of the glass, his mother beside him. the young man Sullivan had brutalized during what should have been a simple traffic stop. Sullivan almost turned around, but something in Marcus's eyes held him. Slowly, Sullivan sat down and picked up the phone. "I didn't come here for you," Marcus said immediately. "I came here for me. For 3 years I've had nightmares about that night. About you standing over me laughing while I tried to breathe with broken ribs. About the way you told me I was lucky you didn't do worse." Sullivan started to speak, but Marcus continued. "I need you to know something. You didn't break me. You tried, but you failed. I graduated from college last year. I'm in law school now, and one day I'm going to be a civil rights attorney who makes sure people like you never have power again." Sullivan's voice failed him. What could he say? That he was sorry, that he didn't mean it, that he was just doing his job. Every excuse crumbled in the face of Marcus's dignified strength. "You took my trust in law enforcement," Marcus continued. "You took my sense of safety. You took 3 ribs and 6 months of recovery time. But you didn't take my future, and now you don't have one. That's justice, Captain Sullivan. That's what justice looks like." Marcus hung up the phone and walked away without looking back, his mother's arm around his shoulders. Sullivan sat there holding the dead phone, staring at his reflection in the glass. The man staring back was a stranger, hollow-eyed, gray-faced, broken. The guard eventually came to escort him back to his cell, where Richard was already asleep, snoring softly. Sullivan climbed onto his bunk and stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the concrete, each one seeming to mirror the fractures in the life he'd built on a foundation of abuse and lies. 3 days ago, he'd been Captain Derek Sullivan, untouchable and unaccountable. Tonight he was federal inmate 47892, facing decades in prison, his name synonymous with police corruption, his legacy one of shame and systemic failure. The transformation was complete, but the reckoning had only just begun. 6 weeks had passed since Sullivan's arrest, and the federal investigation had spread through the Atlanta Police Department like wildfire through drought-stricken forest. The FBI had set up a dedicated task force in a downtown office building, 20 agents working around the clock to unravel 2 decades of corruption. The wall of their operations room was covered with photographs and connecting lines that looked like a spider's web, with Sullivan's picture at the center. Special Agent David Kim stood before this wall, now addressing his team and 3 federal prosecutors who had joined the case. "We've got 14 officers indicted, 6 more under investigation, and Deputy Chief Hammond just agreed to a cooperation deal. He's giving us everything, names, dates, specific incidents where evidence was destroyed or planted." Sarah Chen, the lead prosecutor, studied the wall with grim satisfaction. "Hammond's testimony alone will add another 10 years to Sullivan's sentence. But I want more. I want every victim compensated, every false conviction overturned, every dirty cop in a cell." The morning sun streaming through the windows illuminated boxes of evidence stacked floor to ceiling. 20 years of buried complaints had been exhumed, each one a testament to a system that had protected predators while silencing victims. Among these files was one that would prove particularly damaging: a complaint from 8 years ago by Maria Santos, an immigrant woman who had accused Sullivan of sexual assault during a traffic stop. The complaint had been dismissed after Sullivan claimed she had propositioned him to avoid a ticket. No one had believed Maria. No one had even questioned Sullivan's version of events. But Maria Santos had done something remarkable. She had recorded the encounter on a digital recorder she kept in her purse for English language practice. For 8 years, she had kept that recording, waiting for someone to listen. Now finally someone was. Kim played the recording for the team, and even these hardened federal agents struggled to maintain their composure as they heard Sullivan's voice making explicitly racist and sexual comments, followed by the sounds of Maria crying and begging him to stop. The assault itself wasn't captured clearly, but what was there was damning enough. "This changes everything," Chen said quietly. "This takes us from civil rights violations to sexual assault under color of law. That's a life sentence by itself." Across town in the federal detention center, Sullivan was meeting with Harrison Blake, his attorney looking increasingly haggard as the evidence mounted against his client. Blake spread out the latest discovery documents on the metal table between them, each page another nail in Sullivan's coffin. "Derek, they have everything." Blake said, his professional composure cracking. "They have recordings, videos, financial records showing you took bribes from drug dealers in exchange for protection. They have 17 officers testifying against you. And now—" He paused, sliding Maria Santos's complaint across the table. "They have this." Sullivan read the complaint, his face draining of color as he recognized the incident. She recorded it. Apparently. The FBI verified the authenticity of the recording. "Derek, if this goes to trial, you're looking at life without parole. The jury will destroy you." Sullivan's hands shook as he set down the paper. For weeks, he'd maintained his innocence, claimed he was being railroaded, insisted that his actions were standard police procedure. But faced with Maria Santos's recording, even his capacity for self-deception crumbled. "What do you recommend?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blake leaned back, studying his client with a mixture of professional duty and personal disgust. "Take a deal. Take any deal. Plead guilty, cooperate fully, and pray the judge shows mercy." Meanwhile, Rebecca Washington was testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C. The hearing room was packed with cameras, reporters, and citizens who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. Rebecca sat at the witness table, her posture perfect, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed the senators. "Distinguished members of the committee," she began. "What happened to me was not unique. The only thing unique about my case was that I had the power to fight back. For every judge, lawyer, or public official who experiences police brutality and gets justice, there are thousands of ordinary citizens who suffer in silence." Senator Elizabeth Warren leaned forward, her expression intense. "Judge Washington, what specific reforms would you recommend to prevent another Derek Sullivan from operating with impunity?" Rebecca had prepared for this question, had thought about it every night since the assault. "Senator, we need federal oversight of all police departments, not just those under consent decrees. We need a national database of officers fired for misconduct, preventing them from simply moving to another department. We need independent prosecutors for all police misconduct cases, removing the conflict of interest when local prosecutors investigate officers they work with daily. And we need mandatory minimum sentences for officers who violate civil rights under color of law." Senator Ted Cruz, typically oppositional to federal oversight, surprised everyone with his next statement. "Judge Washington, I'm a strong supporter of law enforcement, but what Captain Sullivan did to you, and apparently to many others, is unconscionable. No badge should be a license for brutality. I'll be supporting your proposed reforms." The bipartisan support was unexpected, but welcome. Rebecca's assault had transcended political lines, becoming a symbol of abuse of power that even the most ardent police supporters couldn't defend. Back in Atlanta, the ripple effects of Sullivan's arrest continued to spread. Officer Michelle Foster, whose career Sullivan had destroyed, had been reinstated with full back pay and promoted to detective. She stood now in Chief Williams's office, receiving her new badge and the apology she'd waited 5 years to hear. "Detective Foster," Chief Williams said formally, "on behalf of the Atlanta Police Department, I apologize for the failure to protect you from retaliation, for the failure to investigate your complaints, and for the damage done to your career. This department failed you, and we're committed to ensuring it never happens again." Foster accepted her new badge with steady hands, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Chief, I don't want apologies. I want change. I want to lead the new Internal Affairs Division you're creating. I want to make sure no other officer goes through what I did for trying to do the right thing." Williams smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her since this crisis began. "I was hoping you'd say that. The job is yours if you want it." As Foster left the office, she passed Officers Chen and Roberts in the hallway. Both men were in civilian clothes, their law enforcement careers effectively over, despite their cooperation with the FBI. They'd become pariahs in the department, heroes to some, but traitors to many who still believed in the blue wall of silence. "Detective Foster," Chen said, nodding respectfully. "Officers," she replied, then paused. "Thank you. I know what it cost you to come forward." Roberts shifted uncomfortably. "We should have done it sooner. We knew what Sullivan was, and we stayed silent too long." "But you didn't stay silent forever," Foster pointed out. "That's more than most can say." The conversation was interrupted by commotion outside. Through the windows, they could see news vans racing into the parking lot. Something big had happened. The news broke simultaneously across all major networks. Patricia Sullivan. Derek's wife was holding a press conference. She stood at a podium in her attorney's office, flanked by her son Derek Jr. and her lawyer. Patricia looked composed but worn, as if she'd aged 10 years in the past 6 weeks. "I'm here today to announce that I'm filing for divorce from Derek Sullivan." She began, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of her words. "But more importantly, I'm here to apologize to his victims and to share information that I should have shared years ago." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "For 20 years, I knew my husband was troubled. I saw the bruises on his knuckles that didn't match his reports. I heard him laughing on the phone with other officers about teaching people lessons. I watched him come home with property that I knew wasn't his, watches, cash, jewelry that he claimed were gifts from grateful citizens. The reporters were frantically scribbling notes, cameras capturing every word. I told myself it was part of the job, that I didn't understand police work, that Derek was a good man doing difficult work. I was wrong. I was complicit in my silence, and I'm here to make that right." Patricia's attorney stepped forward, handing out documents to the reporters. "Mrs. Sullivan has provided the FBI with financial records recordings of conversations and photographs documenting her husband's possession of stolen property. She's cooperating fully with the federal investigation." Derek Jr. stepped to the microphone, his young face etched with pain. "My father was my hero. I wanted to be just like him, finding out what he really was. It's destroyed everything I believed in, but I'd rather know the truth than live a lie. To all the people my father hurt, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what he did and for what our family's silence enabled." In his cell, Sullivan watched his family's betrayal as he saw it on the small television. Richard, his cellmate, whistled low. "Your own wife and kid. That's cold." But Sullivan wasn't listening. He was watching his son, the boy who'd worn plastic police badges as a toddler, who'd brought Sullivan's uniform to show and tell, who'd written essays about his hero father. That boy was gone, replaced by a young man who looked at his father's name with shame. The next morning brought more bad news for Sullivan. 3 more victims had come forward after seeing Patricia's press conference, emboldened by the knowledge that even Sullivan's family recognized his guilt. One of them was an elderly white woman, destroying Sullivan's defense that his actions were standard procedure rather than racially motivated. She described how Sullivan had violently arrested her for questioning his authority during a neighbor dispute, breaking her wrist in the process. Blake visited Sullivan that afternoon with a final plea offer from the prosecution. 25 years possibility of parole after 15 in exchange for a full confession and cooperation in identifying other corrupt officers. Sullivan read the offer 3 times, as if the words might change. 25 years. It's better than life, Derek. And with Maria Santos's recording about to be made public, life is what you're facing. Sullivan thought about his father, a cop who'd served 30 years without a single complaint. He thought about his son, who would spend the next 25 years ashamed of his last name. He thought about the badge he'd worn with such pride, now a symbol of his disgrace. "I'll take it," he said finally, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. The next day, Sullivan sat in a federal conference room with prosecutors, FBI agents, and a court reporter. For 8 hours, he detailed every crime, every cover-up, every officer who'd participated or looked the other way. He named names, described specific incidents, and revealed where evidence had been hidden. It was the most comprehensive confession of police corruption in Georgia history. "Tell us about the death of Officer Tony Morales," Sarah Chen said, referring to a young Latino officer who'd died in what was reported as a training accident 5 years earlier. Sullivan's face went white. That wasn't related to... Officer Morales had filed a complaint against you 2 days before his death. Chen interrupted. A complaint that was never processed because he died before it could be formalized. "Tell us what really happened." For the first time since his arrest, Sullivan looked genuinely afraid. "I need immunity for that. Full immunity or I don't say another word." The prosecutors exchanged glances. They had suspected Morales' death wasn't accidental, but they needed Sullivan's testimony to prove it. "We can offer limited immunity," Chen said carefully. "You won't be charged with murder, but you'll face charges for conspiracy and cover-up." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak. "Morales saw me plant evidence during a drug raid. He was going to report it, said he had photographs. I told Hammond and Hammond said he'd handle it. The next day, Morales had his accident during a training exercise run by Sergeant Bill Cooper, one of Hammond's boys." The room was silent, except for the court reporter's keys clicking. They had just uncovered a murder conspiracy within the Atlanta Police Department. Kim immediately left the room to call his supervisor. Within an hour, Sergeant Bill Cooper was arrested at his home, dragged away in handcuffs as his neighbors watched in shock. Deputy Chief Hammond, who thought his cooperation deal protected him, found himself facing murder conspiracy charges that his deal didn't cover. The news of Officer Morales' murder sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community nationwide. The thin blue line hadn't just protected corruption, it had protected murder. The FBI expanded their investigation, bringing in additional resources from Washington. That evening, Rebecca Washington received a call from the President of the United States. She sat in her home study, still processing the day's revelations, when her phone rang with the distinctive ringtone reserved for official calls. "Judge Washington." The President's voice was warm but serious. "I wanted to personally thank you for your courage in standing up to corruption even at great personal cost. Your testimony before the Senate was powerful and persuasive." "Thank you, Mr. President," Rebecca replied, "but I didn't have a choice. When someone attacks the rule of law itself, silence is complicity." "Which is why I'm calling," the President continued. "The Federal Police Accountability Act that you've championed, I'm going to push for its passage. And when it passes, I want you to consider leading the new Federal Police Oversight Commission it will create." Rebecca was momentarily speechless. The commission would have the power to investigate any police department in the country, to bring federal charges against corrupt officers, to mandate reforms. It would be the most powerful law enforcement oversight body in American history. "Mr. President, I'm honored, but..." "Don't answer now," he interrupted gently. "Think about it. Talk to your family. But know that you have my full support. And more importantly, you have the support of millions of Americans who see you as a symbol of justice, triumphing over corruption." After the call ended, Rebecca sat in the gathering darkness of her study, thinking about the journey from that morning in the parking garage to this moment. Sullivan had tried to humiliate her, to reduce her to nothing more than her skin color. Instead, he had elevated her to a national symbol of resistance against police brutality. Her mother entered the study carrying 2 cups of tea. "Important call." "The President," Rebecca said, still somewhat stunned. "He wants me to lead a new federal commission on police oversight." Her mother set down the tea and took her daughter's hands. "Baby girl, do you remember what I used to tell you when you came home crying? Because kids said you didn't belong in those advanced classes?" Rebecca smiled, remembering that I was put in those rooms for a reason, to change them from the inside. This is just another room, Rebecca, a bigger room with more power to make change. Your whole life has been preparing you for this moment. Meanwhile, in the federal detention center, Sullivan was placed in protective custody after threats from other inmates. The general population had learned about Officer Morales, and even among criminals, killing a cop who was trying to do the right thing was unforgivable. Sullivan found himself in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, alone with his thoughts and the weight of his crimes. He had a single book, a Bible, left by the previous occupant, and found himself reading it for the first time since childhood. The words of Matthew haunted him. "Whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." He thought of all the people he'd brutalized, all the least of these he'd crushed under his boot, and wondered if redemption was even possible for someone like him. A chaplain visited him weekly, an elderly black minister named Reverend James, who had volunteered at the prison for 20 years. Their first meeting was tense, Sullivan expecting condemnation, but Reverend James simply sat quietly waiting for Sullivan to speak. "I don't deserve forgiveness," Sullivan finally said. "Nobody deserves forgiveness," Reverend James replied. "That's why it's called grace. But forgiveness isn't erasure, Mr. Sullivan. Your victims will carry their scars forever. The question is whether you'll carry yours as punishment or as reminder to be better." "How can I be better from in here?" "You're testifying against corrupt officers. That's a start. You're preventing future victims. That matters." Sullivan wanted to argue that he was only testifying to reduce his sentence, but something in the Reverend's calm presence made him consider a different truth, that maybe, just maybe, he could still do some good, even from a prison cell. The trial date was set for 3 months hence, and the entire country seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. This wouldn't just be the trial of Derek Sullivan. It would be the trial of American policing itself, a reckoning with decades of unchecked power and systemic racism. As autumn turned toward winter, Atlanta began to heal and change. The police department implemented new policies requiring all officers to undergo civil rights training and psychological evaluation. Body cameras became mandatory, with severe penalties for turning them off. A civilian review board was established with real power to investigate complaints and recommend prosecution. But the most significant change was in the communities Sullivan had terrorized. People who had been afraid to call the police now had hope that the system might actually protect them. Young people who had grown up seeing police as enemies began to consider that reform was possible. The breach in the blue wall of silence that Sullivan's arrest had created was allowing light to shine into corners that had been dark for too long. Officers Chen and Roberts, despite being pariahs in law enforcement, found new purpose. Chen began law school determined to become a civil rights attorney. Roberts became a counselor for at-risk youth, using his experience to teach them about both the dangers and the possibilities of engaging with law enforcement. Detective Foster threw herself into her new role in internal affairs, investigating complaints with the tenacity of someone who knew firsthand the cost of silence. In her first month, she uncovered 3 cases of evidence tampering and 2 cases of excessive force, all of which resulted in immediate termination and criminal charges. The first day of Derek Sullivan's trial arrived with the kind of bitter cold that Atlanta rarely saw in January. Ice crystals formed on the courthouse steps, making the gathering crowd move carefully as they assembled before dawn, determined to witness history. The line for public seating stretched around the block, a mixture of Sullivan's victims, civil rights activists, law enforcement officers, and citizens who understood that this trial represented something larger than one man's crimes. Inside the federal courthouse, Judge Martin Kellerman's courtroom had been transformed into a fortress of justice. Additional security had been brought in, metal detectors set to their highest sensitivity, and every person entering was thoroughly searched. The threats had been coming for weeks, some against Sullivan from those who wanted street justice, others against the prosecutors and witnesses from Sullivan's remaining supporters who saw the trial as a betrayal of the thin blue line. Rebecca Washington entered through a secure entrance, accompanied by federal marshals who had become her constant shadows since the death threats began. She would be the prosecution's star witness, but today she was simply an observer as jury selection began. She took her seat in the gallery's front row, her presence a silent reminder of why they were all there. Sullivan was brought in through a different entrance, the chains on his ankles clanking against the marble floor with each shuffling step. The months in solitary confinement had transformed him. He'd lost 30 pounds, his once imposing frame now merely large. His hair, which he'd always kept in a military cut, had grown out gray and unkempt. But it was his eyes that showed the most dramatic change. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been fear, or might have been the first stirrings of genuine remorse. The jury selection took 3 days, with both sides fighting over every potential juror. The prosecution wanted diversity people who understood the reality of police brutality. The defense wanted older white conservative jurors who might sympathize with a cop they'd argue had just been doing his job in difficult circumstances. What they ended up with was a cross-section of America, black and white, young and old, rich and poor. 12 people who would decide not just Sullivan's fate, but send a message about what America would and wouldn't tolerate from those sworn to protect and serve. Sarah Chen's opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled fury, wrapped in legal precision. She stood before the jury, her small frame radiating authority as she laid out the government's case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next several weeks, you will hear evidence of a pattern of criminality that spans 2 decades. You will hear from 43 victims who suffered at the hands of Derek Sullivan. You will see video evidence of brutality that was hidden for years. You will learn about evidence planted, lives destroyed, and yes, even murder committed to protect a corrupt system. She paused, letting each word land with its full weight. The defendant took an oath to protect and serve. Instead, he used his badge as a weapon, his authority as a tool of oppression, and his position to terrorize the very communities he was sworn to protect. He believed he was untouchable above the law he claimed to enforce. You, the jury, will show him and everyone else who thinks a badge grants immunity that in America, no one is above the law. Harrison Blake's defense was exactly what everyone expected. Sullivan was a dedicated officer, operating in dangerous conditions, making split-second decisions that were sometimes wrong, but never criminal. The assault on Judge Washington was a tragic misunderstanding, not a crime. The other incidents were exaggerated or taken out of context. It was a thin defense, but Blake delivered it with the conviction of a man who knew he had to try. The prosecution's first witness was Officer Chen, who had aged years in the months since Sullivan's arrest. He testified for 6 hours, detailing incidents he'd witnessed, conversations he'd recorded, and the culture of fear Sullivan had created within the department. "Can you describe the incident from June 15th of last year?" Chen was asked. Chen's voice was steady, but quiet. Captain Sullivan pulled over a black family, mother, father, 2 kids in the back seat. The father had rolled through a stop sign. Routine traffic stop. But Sullivan escalated it. He dragged the father out of the car, slammed him against the hood while his children screamed. The man wasn't resisting, wasn't arguing. Sullivan he wanted to make a point. What point was that? That he could do whatever he wanted. That his badge made him God on those streets. Blake's cross-examination tried to paint Chen as a disgruntled officer seeking revenge. But Chen's quiet dignity and obvious reluctance to testify made him a credible witness. When Blake suggested Chen was exaggerating, Chen pulled out his phone. "I recorded it," he said simply. "Would you like to see the video?" The video was played for the jury, and several members visibly recoiled as they watched Sullivan brutalize an innocent man while his children sobbed in the back seat. The father's crime. He had asked why he was being pulled over when he'd come to a complete stop. Day after day, witnesses took the stand. Marcus Johnson testified about his broken ribs, his mother crying quietly in the gallery as he described the attack. Diego Martinez, now 20, talked about the asthma attack that Sullivan had interpreted as resistance, leading to a broken arm and permanent anxiety around police. Maria Santos testified via video link from Mexico, where she'd fled after Sullivan's assault too afraid to stay in a country where her attacker wore a badge. Her testimony was the most damaging yet. Through a translator, she described in horrific detail what Sullivan had done to her during that traffic stop 8 years ago. When her recording was played, several jurors were in tears. Sullivan's voice on that recording making racist and sexual comments before the assault was so vile that even his defense attorney looked sick. On the 7th day of testimony, Officer Tony Morales' widow took the stand. Isabella Morales was a small woman, but her presence filled the courtroom as she spoke about her husband's final days. Tony came home scared. She said, her accent thick with emotion. He said he'd seen Captain Sullivan plant drugs, said he had pictures on his phone. He was going to report it. He said, "Bella, if something happens to me, it wasn't an accident." 2 days later, he was dead. Blake objected strenuously, arguing this was hearsay and prejudicial, but Judge Kellerman allowed it, noting that Sullivan's own confession had already established the connection to Morales' death. Deputy Chief Hammond testified next, having been brought from his own federal detention where he was awaiting trial for murder conspiracy. His testimony was clinical detached, as if he were describing someone else's crimes. He detailed how complaints against Sullivan were buried, how evidence was destroyed, how officers who tried to report misconduct were threatened or transferred. "And Officer Morales?" Chen asked. Hammond was silent for a long moment. "I told Sergeant Cooper that Morales was a problem. I said he needed to be handled. I didn't explicitly order his death, but I knew Cooper's methods. I knew what would happen. And Captain Sullivan knew too. Sullivan brought me the problem. He knew how it would be solved." The courtroom erupted in whispers until Judge Kellerman's gavel restored order. Sullivan sat at the defense table, his head in his hands. His attorney had stopped taking notes, knowing that no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome this testimony. When Rebecca Washington finally took the stand on day 10, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. She wore the same navy suit she'd worn that morning in the parking garage, a deliberate choice that wasn't lost on observers. Her testimony was precise, professional, and devastating in its clarity. She walked the jury and through every moment of the assault from Sullivan's first aggressive shout to the moment the federal marshals arrived. She testified about the physical pain, the humiliation, the fear that even her position as a federal judge couldn't protect her from a man who saw her only as a black woman who needed to be put in her place. He said, "You people." She testified, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of similar slurs. "In that moment, I wasn't a judge. I wasn't an individual. I was reduced to a racial category that he felt entitled to brutalize." Blake's cross-examination was gentle, knowing that attacking a federal judge would only hurt his client's case. He tried to suggest that Sullivan hadn't known who she was, that it was a tragic misunderstanding. "Mr. Blake?" Rebecca responded with icy calm. "I identified myself 3 times. I showed my federal identification. I cited federal statutes. Your client knew exactly who I was. He just didn't care. Or perhaps more accurately, he cared very much. He saw an accomplished black woman and wanted to remind me that his badge trumped my achievements." The prosecution rested after 2 weeks of testimony that had painted a picture of corruption, brutality, and murder that shocked even experienced court observers. Blake's defense was brief, calling only a few character witnesses who testified about Sullivan's commendations and good deeds, testimony that rang hollow after weeks of evidence showing his crimes. Sullivan himself took the stand on the last day of testimony against his attorney's advice. He looked small in his ill-fitting suit, his voice barely above a whisper, as Blake walked him through his version of events. He admitted to mistakes, to poor judgment, even to excessive force, but maintained he'd never committed crimes, that everything he'd done was within his discretion as a police officer. Chen's cross-examination was brutal and methodical. She played recording after recording, showed video after video, presented document after document, forcing Sullivan to confront the mountain of evidence against him. "This is you planting evidence in Marcus Washington's car, isn't it? It's not clear what. This is your voice on Maria Santos's recording, isn't it? Yes, but This is you telling Deputy Chief Hammond that Officer Morales needed to be dealt with, isn't it? By the end, Sullivan was sobbing on the stand, his attempts at justification crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. His final words before leaving the stand would be replayed on every news channel that night. "I thought the badge made me untouchable. I thought I was the law. I was wrong. God help me, I was wrong." The closing arguments took a full day. Blake made one last attempt to humanize Sullivan, to frame him as a cop who'd lost his way rather than a criminal who'd worn a badge. But Chen's closing was a tour de force that left several jurors in tears. "Derek Sullivan weaponized his badge," she said, standing directly in front of the jury box. "He turned a symbol of protection into an instrument of terror. He didn't make mistakes, he made choices. Every time he planted evidence, he chose to destroy an innocent life. Every time he brutalized a citizen, he chose to violate his oath. Every time he covered up his crimes, he chose corruption over justice." She paused, making eye contact with each juror. "You've heard from 43 victims, but remember, these are just the ones brave enough to come forward. For every person who testified, how many stayed silent out of fear? How many are still carrying trauma inflicted by a man who thought his badge made him God?" The jury deliberated for only 6 hours, remarkably fast for such a complex case. When they filed back into the courtroom, not one of them looked at Sullivan. The foreman, a middle-aged black man who owned a small business, stood to read the verdict. "On count 1 assault on a federal official, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty." The word "guilty" rang out 37 times, once for each count. Sullivan stood motionless, his attorney's hand on his shoulder, the only thing keeping him upright. In the gallery, his victims wept, some with relief, others with the complex emotions that come when justice arrives too late to heal all wounds. Patricia Sullivan and Derek Jr. were notably absent. They had moved out of state, Patricia reverting to her maiden name, trying to build a life free from the shadow of Sullivan's crimes. Judge Kellerman scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, time he would use to review the pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements that were already pouring in. Those 2 weeks saw a transformation in Atlanta. The guilty verdict had sent a clear message that police corruption would no longer be tolerated. More officers came forward with information about misconduct. The city council approved funding for a new civilian oversight board with real power. Police academy curriculum was overhauled to emphasize de-escalation and civil rights. The day of sentencing arrived with the first spring warmth of the year. The courthouse steps were covered with flowers, roses, lilies, carnations left by citizens in honor of Sullivan's victims. A small memorial had been erected for Officer Tony Morales, his photograph surrounded by candles and notes thanking him for trying to do the right thing. The courtroom was again packed as Judge Kellerman took his seat. Sullivan was brought in, and for the first time since his arrest, he looked directly at his victims in the gallery. His eyes found Marcus Johnson, Diego Martinez, Maria Santos on the video screen, and dozens of others. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. What could he possibly say that would matter? Kellerman began with a speech that would be quoted in legal textbooks for years to come. "Mr. Sullivan, you stood before me at your arraignment, and I saw an arrogant man who believed his badge elevated him above the law. Today, I see a broken man who has finally understood that the badge was meant to be a burden of responsibility, not a crown of authority." He paused, his elderly face stern, but somehow sad. "The damage you've done is incalculable. You've destroyed lives, shattered families, and perhaps worst of all, you've damaged the very concept of law enforcement. Every good officer who struggles to build community trust has to work harder because of what you've done. Every citizen who fears police has you as evidence that their fear is justified." Sullivan stood as Kellerman prepared to pronounce sentence, his legs shaking visibly. "Derek Sullivan, on the federal charges, I sentence you to 12 years for the assault on Judge Washington, 20 years for the civil rights violations, 15 years for conspiracy in the death of Officer Morales, and various terms for the remaining charges to be served consecutively. The total sentence is 97 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. 97 years. Sullivan would die in prison, would never again walk free, would never again have the power to hurt anyone, except in their memories. As the marshals prepared to lead Sullivan away, he turned to face the gallery one last time. His voice when he spoke was barely audible, but the courtroom was so quiet that everyone heard him. "I'm sorry," he said, the two words carrying a lifetime of regret that had come too late. "I'm so sorry." Whether his apology was genuine or simply the desperate words of a man facing life in prison, no one could say. But Marcus Johnson's mother stood up and responded, her voice strong and clear. "We don't need your apology. We needed you to see us as human beings. It's too late for sorry, but it's not too late for justice. And today, justice was served." Sullivan was led away, disappearing through the door that led to the rest of his life. A life in a federal cell, haunted by the ghosts of those he'd wronged, remembered not for 20 years of service, but for 20 years of terror. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca Washington stood at the microphones one more time. The press conference was carried live on every major network, the country waiting to hear from the woman whose assault had brought down a corrupt system. Today's sentence sends a clear message. She began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced evil and prevailed. No badge immunizes you from consequences. No uniform authorizes you to brutalize citizens. No oath can be twisted to justify corruption. She looked directly into the main camera, knowing that police officers across the country were watching. To the vast majority of law enforcement officers who serve with honor and integrity, today's verdict is not an attack on you. It's a validation of what you stand for. Sullivan betrayed your profession, and his sentence reflects that betrayal. Then her expression softened slightly. And to those who are currently engaged in the same behavior that brought Sullivan to this courtroom, let me be clear, we're coming for you. The era of impunity is over. The blue wall of silence has fallen. Justice may have been delayed, but it will no longer be denied. The crowd erupted in applause, but Rebecca raised her hand for silence. She had one more thing to say. "I want to announce that I've accepted President's appointment to chair the new Federal Police Oversight Commission. We begin our work next month, and we will not rest until every citizen in this country can interact with law enforcement without fear of brutality, discrimination, or corruption. What happened to me should never happen to anyone again. And now, finally, we have the tools to make sure it doesn't." As Rebecca left the podium surrounded by federal marshals and supporters, she thought about her mother's words from months ago about bending the arc of the moral universe toward justice. Today, that arc had bent a little more. In the federal prison, where Sullivan would spend his first night of a 97-year sentence, he sat in his new cell, a different facility from the detention center, this one in Colorado, far from anyone who might want to help or hurt him. His cellmate was a former hedge fund manager doing 20 years for fraud, a man who looked at Sullivan with open curiosity. "So you're the cop who assaulted the federal judge," the man said. It wasn't a question. Sullivan nodded, too exhausted to speak. 97 years, the cellmate continued. "That's basically life plus forever. Was it worth it, the power trip?" Sullivan thought about the question, really thought about it. 20 years of terrorizing people, of feeling like God with a badge, of destroying lives because he could. And now, 97 years in a cage, his name synonymous with police corruption. His family destroyed, his legacy, one of shame. "No," he said finally. "Nothing is worth this." The lights went out for the night, and Derek Sullivan lay on his narrow bunk, staring into the darkness that would be his only companion for the rest of his life. Somewhere in Atlanta, Marcus Johnson was graduating from law school. Diego Martinez was becoming a counselor for at-risk youth. Maria Santos was slowly healing from her trauma. Judge Rebecca Washington was preparing to lead a national reform movement. Life went on, justice had been served, and the world kept turning. But in a federal prison cell in Colorado, time stood still for a man who had thought a badge made him untouchable, only to learn that justice, though sometimes slow, is inexorable. The transformation was complete. Captain Derek Sullivan, who had once ruled Atlanta's streets through fear and brutality, was now just inmate number 47892, counting the days in a calendar that stretched nearly a century into a future he would never see as a free man. The case of Derek Sullivan would be studied in police academies and law schools for generations, a cautionary tale of how power corrupts and how that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, can be brought to light. But more than that, it became a symbol of hope, proof that even the most powerful can be held accountable, that victims' voices matter, and that justice, however delayed, will eventually prevail.